If you've spent any time in modern witchcraft circles, you've probably heard someone say, we are the descendants of the witches they couldn't burn. It's a powerful phrase, it's emotional, it's inspiring. The problem is that it isn't entirely true. Now, most people accused of witchcraft weren't witches. Many weren't practitioners of folk magic. Many had never cast a spell, spoken an incantation, or performed a ritual in their entire lives. But that doesn't make what happened any less important. In fact, the truth is far more disturbing than the myth itself. Because the witch hunts weren't or were never really about magic, they were about power. They were about control. They were about deciding who gets to define reality and who gets punished for refusing to accept it. And if you're interested in punk magic, that matters. Because once you understand the history of witch hunts, you start seeing the same machinery operating everywhere. Different targets, different language, different uniforms, but the same machinery. The story most people know begins somewhere in medieval Europe, where supposedly everyone believed witches were flying around on broomsticks, making pacts with the devil and cursing livestock. The reality is far more complicated. For much of the Middle Ages, church authorities were actually skeptical of many popular beliefs about witchcraft. There were certainly concerns about magic, curses, and heresy, but the massive organized witch hunts most people imagine hadn't really begun yet. The great wave of witch persecution emerged later. All right, so between roughly the 15th and 18th centuries. Now, during a period when Europe was experiencing enormous social upheaval, the religious conflict, political instability, economic collapse, disease, war, climate disruption, population shifts, everything was changing. And whenever societies experience extreme stress, somebody gets blamed. History shows this pattern over and over again. People become frightened, leaders become desperate, institutions become insecure. And suddenly an enemy appears. An enemy supposedly responsible for all the chaos. An enemy that can conveniently be identified, isolated, and punished. In the case of the witch hunts, that enemy was the witch. The witch became a symbolic container for society's fears. Crooked harvest, witch. Child dies unexpectedly, witch. Livestock sick, witch. Economic hardship, witch. Political unrest, witch. The witch just became the explanation for uncertainty itself. And here's where things become especially relevant to us. The people accused often occupied positions outside normal structures of power. These would be midwives, healers, widows, poor women, unmarried women, social outsiders, religious dissidents, the elderly, the disabled, the eccentric, the inconvenient, not because these groups were secretly practicing dangerous magic, but because they were vulnerable. They lacked institutional protection. The state could reach them, the church could reach them, the courts could reach them, and society would often support it. The witch hunt wasn't merely an attack on individuals. It was a public lesson, a warning, a demonstration of authority, an announcement that deviation carried consequences. And that should sound familiar, because every authoritarian system eventually learns the same lesson. Fear is useful. A frightened population is easier to manage. A population convinced that invisible enemies lurk everywhere becomes willing to surrender freedoms in exchange for security. Okay? The witch hunts operated through exactly this mechanism. People were encouraged to report neighbours. Suspicion became virtue. Accusation became evidence. Fear became self-reinforcing. The machine fed itself. And once the machine starts moving, it doesn't need facts. It only needs momentum. One accusation creates another. One trial creates another. One execution justifies another. The system becomes its own proof. This is one reason why Punk Magick places such an importance on questioning narratives. Not because every narrative is false, but because power often survives by convincing people not to ask questions. The moment questioning becomes dangerous, something important is happening. The witch hunts weren't only about religion, they were also about centralized authority. As emerging nation states consolidated power, local traditions increasingly came under suspicion. Folk practices that had existed for generations suddenly became problems. Community knowledge became suspect. Regional customs became suspect. Independent authority became suspect. If power wants uniformity, diversity becomes a threat. And think about that for a moment. A village healer possesses knowledge not controlled by church or state. That creates a problem. A local wise woman commands respect from her community. That creates a problem. A person turns to folk remedies instead of official institutions. That again creates a problem. Not because any of these things are inherently dangerous, but because power prefers dependence. Independent sources of authority compete with centralized authority, and institutions rarely enjoy competition. This is one reason modern witches often feel an instinctive connection to those persecuted during the hunts. Not because they necessarily share the same practices or because there's a direct lineage, but because the underlying conflict remains recognizable. The conflict between imposed authority and individual agency. The conflict between control and autonomy. The conflict between conformity and self-determination. The names change, the dynamics remain. Now, here's where I think many modern discussions miss something important. The people accused during the witch hunts were not always rebels. Many were ordinary people trying to survive. Many desperately wanted acceptance. Many were deeply religious or had no interest whatsoever in challenging the system. And yet they were targeted anyway. That's important because oppression doesn't always require rebellion. Sometimes difference alone is enough. Sometimes vulnerability alone is enough. Existing outside a preferred category is enough. Authoritarian systems don't merely punish resistance, they often manufacture it. They define certain people as threats, whether those people wish to be threats or not. The accusation creates the enemy. The label creates the outsider. The story creates the criminal. And once you understand that, you begin to see how labels function politically. Heretic, witch, traitor, subversive, radical, degenerate, cultist, dangerous. The specific words change throughout history, but the mechanism remains remarkably consistent. Create a category. Attach fear to it. Expand the definition. Punish those who fall inside it. Then encourage everyone else to police themselves. The beauty of this system from the perspective of power is that it becomes largely self-maintaining. People start regulating their own behavior. They monitor their own speech. They suppress their own thoughts. No prison walls required. The prison exists inside the mind. And this is where punk magic becomes more than aesthetic. It's not about wearing black clothes. It's not about patches and spikes. It's not about pretending to be rebellious. It's about recognizing when systems attempt to colonize your imagination. Because the deepest form of control isn't physical, it's psychological. The moment someone successfully defines the limits of what you are allowed to think, question, imagine, or become, they've achieved something more powerful than coercion. They've recruited your own mind against you. Historically, there were always people who resisted, not necessarily through open revolution, sometimes through survival, sometimes through preserving traditions, through storytelling, through secret gatherings, or refusing to surrender their worldview entirely. Resistance doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always involve barricades. Sometimes resistance means carrying forbidden knowledge through generations. Sometimes it means keeping a flame alive during dark times. Sometimes it means refusing to forget, and that's one reason magical traditions have endured. Not because they were always powerful, but because they were resilient. Ideas can survive things that institutions cannot. Governments collapse, churches fracture, empires disappear, yet stories endure. Symbols endure, practices endure, human curiosity endures. The desire to seek direct experience of mystery endures. The desire to connect with something larger than ourselves endures. No amount of persecution can ever successfully eliminate that. Not permanently, because it appears to be woven into human nature itself. People continue searching. People continue questioning. People continue reaching beyond official explanations. And every generation seems to produce new forms of magic. New myths, new symbols, new ways of encountering the unknown. That's why I don't see punk magic as merely a revival of old traditions. I see it as a participation in a much older pattern. The refusal to hand over total authority concerning meaning. The refusal to allow institutions to completely define reality. The willingness to investigate experience directly, to experiment, to question, to doubt, to discover. Not because every tradition is correct, not because every belief is true, but because inquiry itself matters. The witch hunts teach us that, or what happens when inquiry becomes dangerous, when curiosity becomes suspicious, when difference becomes criminal, when fear becomes policy. And perhaps the most important lesson is this. The witch hunts didn't happen because people were uniquely evil. They happened because ordinary people participated. Ordinary people believed. Ordinary people compiled. Ordinary people looked away. That's what makes history uncomfortable. It's easy to imagine ourselves as heroes, much harder to imagine ourselves as participants. Yet understanding that possibility is essential, because the machinery of persecution doesn't arrive wearing a sign that says oppression. It arrives disguised as safety, as morality, as necessity, as common sense. It arrives wrapped in stories that sound reasonable. That's why critical thinking matters. That's why questioning matters. That's why independent thought matters. And that's why magical practice, at its best, can be profoundly political. Not because it supports a particular party, not because it serves an ideology, but because it encourages direct engagement with experience. It asks you to observe, to test, to explore, to encounter mystery firsthand rather than accepting second-hand answers. That attitude can be dangerous to systems built on unquestioned authority. Always has been. Which brings us back to the witch. Not the Hollywood witch, not the fantasy witch, not even necessarily the historical witch, but the witch as symbol. The person who stands outside prescribed boundaries. The person who asks forbidden questions. The person who seeks knowledge beyond official approval. The person who refuses to surrender their relationship with the unknown. Every age creates its witches. Every age creates its outsiders. Every age creates its scapegoats. And every age creates people willing to challenge the story. The question is never whether witch hunts belong to history. The question is whether we recognize the pattern when it reappears. Because the forms change, the targets change, the language changes, but the machinery remains remarkably familiar. And perhaps the most punk thing you can do is refuse to become part of it. Question the narratives, challenge the assumptions, protect the outsider, defend curiosity, defend imagination, defend the right to seek meaning beyond authorized boundaries, because every act of genuine inquiry is a small rebellion against intellectual conformity, and every refusal to participate in fear is an act of resistance. The fires may have gone out, the stakes may be gone, but the struggle between authority and freedom continues. It always has, and it probably always will.